there is, bias is essentially fear of unknown. So when we overcome that fear, when we help our managers overcome their fear of unknown and their biases and preconceptions, that's when actually magic happens.
My name is Katarina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at eCulture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On today's episode of the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, I am speaking to Adina Avram about DEIB in the employee lifecycle. Adina is the head of DEIB and talent development at Trivium Packaging. We have this episode quite a few months in the making, so I'm very excited to be talking to her today about all things DEIB across the whole employee lifecycle. So starting with recruitment, talent management, L&D, exit interviews, you name it, we're going to cover it. This is a two-part episode. So we're going to cover recruitment and talent management in the first one, and then we're going to go over to learning and development and exit in the second part. So be sure to chime in 2 weeks' time again to hear our second part of the conversation. We will go into the significance of DE&I in beyond recruitment. So not only recruitment as we normally do on this podcast, but really cover all of the different stages that an employee goes through. And I'm very excited. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Adina Avram. All right. Welcome everyone to the podcast and a very warm welcome to Adina Avram. It's so great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and especially happy that I can talk about diversity and inclusion, which is a very close topic to my heart.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have you on this topic specifically. Today, we are talking all things DEIB in the whole employee lifecycle. As you know, we are a podcast that is very much focused on recruitment, but that doesn't mean that we only focus on that. I think especially the DE&I topic deserves a much larger conversation around where it should sit in an organization and how it impacts and how it should facilitate the employee life cycle. So that is our topic of today. We have decided up front already to cut this episode into two parts. The first part's going to be recruitment and talent management. The second part's going to be L&D and exit. Very excited to have this first conversation now, and then please tune in 2 weeks' time again, where we will finish our conversation. Before we kick this episode off officially and dive into the topic, could you briefly introduce yourself, what you do, who you are, and everything that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yes, of course. My name is Adina Avram. I work as head of talent and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at Trivium Packaging. And in my free time, I also help organizations by consulting on topics related to diversity and inclusion. I also give keynotes and coach people from underrepresented groups.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. Sounds like you are the go-to person for anything DEIB within the organization, but also outside, which is why I'm especially happy to have you on today. I would love to go all the way back in your biography and ask where your interest for DE&I started and how it has informed your expertise.
Mm-hmm. Well, I touched base for the first time with DEIB back in university in 2007, 2008, when I joined an organization called ISEC. The main purpose of this organization was to create exchange opportunities for students to become leaders with positive impact in society. Fast forward since then, my career or corporate career in DEIB started in 2020. And afterwards, I also joined an executive diversity and inclusion program at University of Amsterdam.
Right. So you come from, your roots with DE&I are in your student life, going into corporate and then pursuing education as well to formalize that again later on. So it sort of comes full circle for you. That's wonderful. What does then diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging mean to you?
Yeah, so I have been also an expat, living and working in 6 different countries or 5 different countries on the top of my original country. Being a woman and neurodivergent also had a big influence on my decision to pursue a career in DIB. So needless to say that DIB is not just work or career, but it's also a lifestyle and a passion for me.
Yeah, I think you have that probably in common with most DE&I professionals, that it's not just a 9 to 5, it's really the way that we see the world, the perspective that we have on everything. Sort of it informs our private lives as much as it does our personal and professional lives, I think. But thank you so much for an introduction, a little bit on how you connect to the topic. Now, today we're going to talk about not necessarily about you, but more so about the work that you do, and also, well, mainly about how organizations leverage DE&I, so how they embed it in the employee lifecycle. I would love to start where it probably starts for most employees in recruitment. How can organizations ensure a diverse and inclusive candidate pool during the recruitment process, would you say?
Yeah. I think actually it starts before the recruitment with employee branding, right? So one tip to attract diverse candidates, I think, is also having an inclusive employer branding strategy. Showing representation, showing inclusive initiatives that are being rolled out in the organization, exposing different employees and sharing the stories of diverse employees, of diverse perspectives with the world is also helping attracting talent. Having a diverse recruitment team is also something that can help contribute, because familiarity bias goes both ways, right? Goes also in attracting diverse candidates. When we look specifically at the recruitment process, diversifying talent pool, I believe, is key. It's extremely important to not only use 1 or 2 certain channels, or only have passive recruitment where employee or candidates are the ones applying, but actively reach out to diverse organizations and communities and NGOs to help expand the talent pool and make the brand known to different employee groups. For example, at Trivium, we are partnering in Spain with BATA, which is an association that is specialized in placing people from the autism spectrum in organization. And this has been an extremely successful collaboration for us. And we aim to expand this in other regions around the globe as well. So this is just a small example, but of course, we can expand to different talent groups and different abilities. When it comes to recruitment, another very important thing is to also have an inclusive culture, because it's one thing to attract diversity, and it's very easy to measure and count the different diversity elements, but actually retaining the talent is what is most challenging. So my advice would be work in parallel, not just focus on attracting diverse talent, but also creating a safe space for them to feel included and feel like they are thriving. In a lot of organizations, we see also still in our plans that at times we maybe don't have gender neutral toilets everywhere, or we don't have maybe access for people of different abilities, or we don't maybe have at times working conditions that cater for different needs and sensibilities. So all these are factors that can be taken into consideration when looking at hiring and retaining diverse talent.
That's a great summary, and you touched on so many things. If I can summarize what you just said, I falsely assumed that it starts with recruitment. I think you're very right in saying it starts with employer branding, and maybe even starts with inclusive culture. if you have an inclusive culture and the employees that you already have are standing behind that and sort of feeling that belonging to the organization, it's much easier to build out and create that authentic employer branding to attract more diverse candidates, and to then also retain them if you sort of go full circle and say, well, all of these things that you just mentioned, gender neutral toilets, accessibility, making work environment flexible for each person's requirements and needs. It's sort of a loop that goes around, which is, I think, a very nice way of you showing it's not just about one thing or the other. I think that's also why we're having this conversation. It's not just about recruitment. It's about everything, right?
Yeah. And of course, when you have this inclusive culture, it's also indirectly educating and creating that awareness and exposing also employees and line managers and recruitment teams to the topics or the principles of bias, of DEIB, because there are still managers and employees out there who choose to maybe at times ignore that there is a problem. And you can still hear statements like, I see no color, or I see no gender, or I see no differences. But when we don't see these differences, or when we don't acknowledge that these differences exist, we are also more prone to discriminate consciously or subconsciously. So education plays a key role to make sure that we see the differences and we accept them, and we create a space where everybody feels safe and included.
That's a wonderful summary as well, and a wonderful point to add on. It's very much about education and awareness from the beginning. I think recruitment, DE&I roles, HR roles can be wonderful champions of that. But I think what's really needed is to have leadership on board in that. So making sure that leadership is aware, leadership is championing that change towards a more diverse and inclusive and equitable organization in all different ways. So I think adding on that piece of awareness and education is a great one to complete that puzzle.
No, absolutely. And that's why, for example, at Trivium, we created a strategic diversity forum. So we do have the employee resource groups, but in addition to the employee resource group, we also created a diversity forum where we have 4 members. So we have the CEO, the CFO, head of HR, and head of sustainability and R&D. Because we really are looking to accelerate the DEIB agenda, not only from the top down, but also from bottom up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great. I wish that every organization I talk to had these sorts of initiatives. Really speaks to your work and how important it's been. I want to, before we move on to bigger topics, want to hear a little bit about the strategies that you have seen effectively minimize bias in hiring. You mentioned a little bit around, well, if we're not inclusive, if we don't really focus on DEIB, it's so easy to turn a blind eye to discrimination, especially when it comes to hiring managers. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
One thing that works, in my opinion, the best or has the most impact is education and awareness, but also exposure of line managers to different employee groups. At times, organizations might not have diverse talent to expose their managers to. So in situations like that, my advice would be to invite diverse speakers or diverse keynote or trainers or educators to bridge that gap, because the more we expose our managers and our employees to different talent groups, the more likely is to bridge that unknown. And we know that bias is also caused by fear of unknown. So the more we reduce that gap, I feel the more likely we are to increase awareness and help attract and retain and hire diverse talent.
That's an interesting take. I think mostly when I ask a question like this, I get an answer around education, super important. Bring in people who can do trainings for you, sort of unconscious bias trainings, structured interview trainings, all of those sorts of things. So it's quite interesting that you bring in a different perspective on, well, exposure is very important. Yeah. As much as it sounds a bit off, maybe to some of our listeners' ears, but it is true that what you say in saying, well, we always fear what we don't know. Yeah. So the more we can familiarize ourselves with differences that we have with other people, the more the less it becomes an issue.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen it live, and I've seen it working so many times, because there is, bias is essentially fear of unknown. So when we overcome that fear, when we help our managers overcome their fear of unknown and their biases and preconceptions, that's when actually magic happens.
Yeah, I think what you said is super important to mention, that piece around, while it is exposure and it is bringing in people with different backgrounds, to make sure that we familiarize ourselves with our differences, and that the unknown isn't that scary. I think there's so many things that we can mention in terms of practical applications, in terms of minimizing bias, whether that's an assessment that provides more objective insights into a candidate's abilities, skills assessments, I think also very important. Structured interviews where you use scorecards. I think there's so many tools that can be applied on a practical level. But I think what comes maybe before, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that exposure piece and that sort of awareness piece. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely the exposure is the first step. And then, of course, offering the hiring teams that support in terms of tools and the ways of working is definitely also very important. For example, at Trivium, we try to implement this rule where every candidate is interviewed by at least 3 people, and of different genders or different diversity groups. So having that diverse hiring committees is a very easy way of achieving a more or a less biased assessment.
Yeah, you mentioned a really good point.
It's good that you mentioned the tools, because what I'm hearing more and more, especially with the development of AI, I hear a lot of companies branding themselves as being the solution to reduce bias, or the solution to prevent discrimination. And I think that's amazing that all these companies are appearing and becoming more and more known on the market. On the other hand, I would also advise the HR community to really look into how those tools were developed. What is the research behind it? Who is on the board of these companies? Who is advising these companies based on what elements or what are the configuration behind those assessments? Because we know that the majority of the assessment tools are created to fit the majority. But then when we talk of, for example, neurodiversity community, we know they do not fit in the majority. So more often than not, at times assessment tools can reject very talented candidates just because they don't fit in their standards. So it's very important when we are using tools to also have a bit of research behind it and ask a few questions around how these tools were developed, how the team looks behind this, how the developing teams look like, what is the diversity factor there? Because we know that when diverse teams work in developing a product, it's more likely, again, to be more representative for different groups.
Yeah, thank you so much for that add-on and that tip. I think that's something we talk a lot about in this podcast as well, to say, especially when it comes to technology, especially when it comes to implementing something new, do take that time to research exactly and ask those questions, exactly those that you just mentioned. Are we, again, using tools, tests, assessments that are then, again, built for the majority? Yeah. So then we're furthering that that difficulty to actually create truly inclusive processes. So I think what you mentioned is very important. As much as I think, well, I'm very partial in this conversation, but of course, I'm happy to see. And we're not the only solution. We're not the only assessment provider. There's so many out there that might be a better fit, even or an equal fit. It's really about setting out and finding that tool for you and meeting those expectations for your organization that you might be looking for. So that's a wonderful addition. Thank you so much. I think we covered in very sort of broad strokes the recruitment topic. I think we're ready to move on to talent management, which I'm very excited about to talk about because it's something that branches a little bit out from this podcast already. First of all, I want to ask you to define talent management. What does that look like in your organization, and also in your view, what should it be?
Okay, well, talent management at Trivium encompasses almost the entire employee lifecycle. So when it comes to employer branding, recruitment, talent development, learning and development, and eventually the exit. So it's an overarching umbrella. And then, of course, within the talent management, the broader scope, we also have the talent management processes, which refer more closely to the usual assessment and evaluation processes aimed to retain, engage, and develop employees, such as performance development reviews or talent reviews, succession planning, and so on.
So it's a very big umbrella term at Trivium, especially for everything that encompasses talent.
Yeah, including culture.
Including culture. Yeah, which, slight disclaimer, might not be the same in your organization to the ones who are listening right now. But from this perspective, taking talent management as such a core and such an important department and sort of overarching function in an organization, where does DE&I come into play with talent management then specifically?
Well, I think we touched upon a little bit already on the recruitment. So on the first part, but DEIB can be integrated at every single step of the employee life cycle in different ways. And when we do this, we also prevent tokenism or tokenistic approach to DEIB, because it becomes embedded in our processes and ways of working. So I always advise organizations, if you have to choose between spending your DEIB efforts in integrating DEIB in your processes and ways of working versus spending thousands or times hundreds of euros on marketing campaigns or events that are happening once per year, choose the first option. Choose to invest in embedding DEIB in your ways of working and processes, because that's where real change is happening. Because if we start with DEIB from onboarding or from even recruitment to onboarding and the development, basically the employees are in touch with this topic throughout their employment life cycle. And this is also how the basis of cultures are being set. And we set a certain norms and expectation, or a certain standard, a minimum standard of behavior within the organization. Of course, this is not the Holy Grail, and it's not the only way to create inclusive cultures, but definitely is the basis to it. So once the DEIB practices are implemented in the employee life cycle, then the advice is to move to the product or service life cycle. So basically you have your house on order, then you can also move to have a positive impact in your society or through your products or in the communities that you are working with.
It's great that you mentioned that. We do cover in passing in a bunch of our episodes sort of the business impact of DE&I. Yeah. I think it's often maybe a bit misunderstood or misguided in terms of what effect DE&I can have on the business. I think the way that you lay it out and saying, well, first we need to focus on the house, the organization, the internal, having that sort of in place, and then we can move to outward facing services, products, what have you. I think that's a wonderful way of ensuring that there is a structure behind it. Because I think, as you say, there's quite a lot of those maybe short-term initiatives, whether it be recruitment events sort of to boost your employer branding, or to put out a marketing campaign that ties your service somehow to DE&I. That might just be those little sparks might not do much to get that fire going, if I can use that metaphor. So I think it's really good that you mention.
Ideally, if you have budget or if you have initiatives, you would do everything at once, right? So that's also not to say that you have to do HR first and then move into production or service development. It can happen in parallel. But if you have to choose, I would advise start with putting your own house in order, because otherwise it might backfire through different news or PR crises. When you have a marketing campaign focused on your inclusive products, but then you might have an employee or in-house a PR scandal which says otherwise. So it's always good to have the culture of DEIB ingrained in the way you work and in the culture, and how your employees are representing that culture externally. That's also extremely important.
Yeah, so
because in the end we know that our employees are our ambassadors as well.
That's what I was going to say. It's a much bigger it's of much bigger importance, because well, there's no organization without employees, but also there's no new talent coming in without the existing employees championing what this organization has to offer in terms of culture, not necessarily just sort of the vanity things that we look at in a job description. I very much agree. If we go one step deeper here, could you give us an example on how DE&I can be implemented in talent management processes?
Yes, of course. So most companies are having a way of evaluating employees, right? That sometimes they are called performance development reviews or yearly assessment, or you name it. It can happen once per year, several times per year. It can be an ongoing process, once every 2 years. So every company works differently. But I guess what is important, what is one common denominator, is that the process needs to be known. So to be transparent. The assessment criteria also need to be transparent. So when we set certain standards, we also need to communicate them to our employees so they know what is expected of them. When we are setting objectives, it's important to reinforce the idea that the objectives need to be SMART. So very specific, measurable, tangible, time-framed, and realistic. Right. So setting clear objectives and expectations and communicating these objectives, assessment standards are extremely important. And oftentimes when companies are doing, especially the more traditional PDR process, we are often looking at the how and the what. So what is the employee delivering, and also how are they delivering? And while the what can be more specific and tangible, I see that the process going a bit off or being subject to bias a bit more when it comes to the how. So the how part is usually where bias managers might assess more likability, or what I call coffee machine popularity, right? So how present you are, or how your communication skills are oftentimes assessed here. Networking skills are often assessed here, but these are also the skills that maybe more introverted employees or more analytical employees or some neurodivergent employees might lack at. And this is also the area where we tend to maybe at times discriminate more. So it's extremely important to, when we are evaluating also the how, to put some very specific criterias and competencies behind those measurements. So we are moving away from assessing coffee machine popularity and into assessing real behavior and similarities with the company culture that we want to promote. Again, clarity, transparency is extremely important. Focus on skills and competencies is another thing that is something that we clearly need to define for a certain position. What are the skills? What are the competencies? And how we are measuring our employees against them. So these are just a few examples. Of course, having calibration committees and having diverse assessment groups, again, can help reduce the bias. And encouraging people to speak up, because oftentimes we do have these calibration committees, but people don't speak up, which can become problematic, again, if they don't feel safe to speak up. Again, in order to ensure that subjectivity, another important thing is to have different data sources. So when we are looking at evaluating someone's performance, let's not just look at their deliverables, but also look at 360 feedbacks, or maybe customer feedback, or try to assess through the employee engagement survey, if we have a more modern tool which can assess blind surveys or confidential assessments, then let's implement those as well and take that data into account as well when we create a more holistic overview of an employee's performance. Because this is also when assessments can go wrong, where we only look at one source of data, and especially when that one source of data is the manager's assessment, then that can be rather challenging to prevent bias.
Definitely. I think you touched on so many. One I'm hearing from you is getting very clear on the skills and competencies that make up a job. So really working on, as well with all of the talent functions, on a competency framework, on something that employees can very clearly be scored on where they land with their performance. I think that's a wonderful addition. And then that feedback cycle and speaking up. I think a lot of what happens in that step of performance reviews is authority bias around, well, someone saying something, or the hiring manager the manager of the person being reviewed, having a very clear authority over everyone else, and then no one being sort of able or feeling safe enough to step up. I think that's a great addition there. And then the multiple sources of feedback. We can't just rely on the gut feeling of a manager saying, well, they're easy to work with, so we're good to go. We need a lot more than that.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. That is all we have time for in part one. I'm going to ask you about your second part of this answer in the second part. So please tune in again in 2 weeks' time to hear the rest of our conversation. And until then, have a wonderful time.